Hi, Peter Charles here, folks, fly fishing. And today let's talk about Airflo PolyLeaders. Now, before I get into how we use them, let's talk about what they are. A polyleader is, as the name suggests, part of our leader system. It's something that we hook on to the front of a fly line. And they come in a variety of densities, from floating down to like a type 6, which is a super extra fast sinker. So it enables us to take a standard floating line and essentially turn it into a sink tip if we wanted to. It gives us options about using our standard floater that otherwise we'd have to change lines. We'd have to actually change spools. So it's a very quick way to add some depth to a fly, or to extend the leader and get increased turnover. A variety of different things you can do with polyleaders. However, when we're getting into using polyleaders, it's not just a case of going out, buying a pack and slapping it on the front of our fly line and having everything work beautifully. We have to make sure that the polyleader we're buying is suitable to the fly line we're going to be putting it on. And that's the subject of this video, is how to make sure that whatever we're getting is going to work on the line that we have on our fly rods. So let's get started about what a polyleader actually looks like. Well, a polyleader is actually mono, and you can see the mono to the one side here, and the other side is coated. You can see there's the coating, and there's the mono. You can get a variety of lengths, anywhere from 5 feet up to 14 feet. So you have a mono core and a coating on it. And that coating can be floater, intermediate, hover, which is a slow intermediate. And then we get a variety of tungsten impregnated versions that give us different sink rates. Now, the thing is, they are tapered, so they turn over smoothly. And they're intended to be used with some tippet added to them. That side is my core from my polyleader. I've got a perfection loop, and then there's my tippet section with a perfection loop. So what I've done is I have got this piece of tippet material added to the front of the polyleader. So whenever you are using a polyleader, you're always going to have some tippet on the front of it. You never tie your fly right to the polyleader. So that's issue number one. The back end of a polyleader has a loop, as you can see it here beside my fingernail. So that's the part we loop-to-loop connect to our fly lines. So that gives us that loop-to-loop connection, so we can take them off and put them on quite easily. Of course, you require a loop on the front of your fly line to do that. But most fly lines today that you can buy have loops already made for you, so you're good to go. Makes it easy. So you've got a polyleader that has a loop at one end. You have to tie a perfection loop at the other, or you can connect it directly to the tippet material. You have to use tippet material to extend it. You never use it straight to the fly, and they're tapered to get them to turn over nicely. So, is that enough to know? Well, no, unfortunately, we need to know more. They come in a variety of lengths and types. I mean, there's so many of them, I had to print them out to give you an idea. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But we've got salmon and steelhead polyleaders. We've got bonefish polyleaders. We have trout. We have bass. We have light trout. All these different types. And there are all these different types for a variety of reasons. One of the most important reasons is the breaking strain of that mono core. If the breaking strain is too light, let's say you're using light trout, and you're going after salmon with it, well, guess what? Light trout's only 8 pound. Good chance you're going to break the core on a fish. So typically what you see is light trout is 8 pound, trout is 12, salmon steelhead is 24, some of the saltwater ones are 24 pound, and the extra strong are 40 pound. So we have enough core strength there to use appropriate to the fishing we're going to be doing. The other thing that you should make a habit of always doing is making sure that whatever tippet material you tie on to the polyleader has a lower breaking strain than the core. Now, it does say on the packet what the core strength is. So, pay attention to that so you don't end up tying on, let's say, you're using a trout polyleader with a 12-pound test, and you tie a 15-pound test tippet, and then you snag up, and when you break it off, it breaks your polyleader. That's not good. So always make sure it's probably at least 25% less breaking strain to ensure that you're breaking the tippet and not the polyleader when you snag up. Another issue to be aware of with polyleaders, and this is true with competitor products as well, is that when you're looking at, let's say, a floater polyleader versus the fastest sinking polyleader, they get heavier the denser they are. So, a fast sink is denser than an intermediate. A super extra fast sink is denser than fast sink. And it's such a difference is that I've got here a salmon steelhead floater, and this trout, both are 10 feet, and this trout extra super fast sinker is heavier, in fact is double the weight of that salmon steelhead floater. So the salmon steelhead floater has a 24-pound core, the trout has a 12-pound core, so you would think the trout would be lighter. It's not. It's double the weight of the floater. So as you can imagine, when you get up to something like this 14-pound super extra fast or super fast sinker, that's really heavy. So that impacts the lines we can use to cast these polyleaders with. If I was going to go out with a relatively light line, I might be able to cast anything up to, say, a fast sink without too much difficulty. I get into the super fast and the extra super fast, which are much heavier. All of a sudden, I start to struggle. So you have to be aware of the fact that there is a significant increase in weight as we go up in density. And therefore, the fly line we're using to cast these polyleaders must be appropriate to the job. So what do we want to use? First off, be aware that if you're going to be using a trout line, a light trout line, like a 4-weight, you're going to be using the light trout leaders, which are 5 foot long. Don't try to use a polyleader or one of the big 10-foot extra super fast polyleaders. It's not going to work. It's going to be pretty awful. There's just not enough turnover force in that 4-weight. So on this reel here, I've got an elite double taper 4-weight on this reel. Now, if I was to try and put a polyleader on the front of that, let's say a 10-foot super extra fast sink, not going to go. All right. A 5-foot light will. Not a problem. I could put a 5-foot light polyleader on this. I'll cast it just fine. So the lighter trout, say 4 weights, even 5 weights, you want to stick with the light stuff. If you get around about, a chunky 5-weight line or a 6-weight line, then we can go up to those 10-foot trout leaders without any trouble, and they'll work. So what do we want in characteristics for a fly line? Well, if you've got a front taper that's designed for finesse and delicacy, that's not a good choice, except for the really, really light polyleaders. You need a fly line that's chunky, like the Kelly Galoop streamer line, like this one right here. It's got a very short front taper, and it has a thick tip, those two things together. Short front taper, thick tip. When you put those two things together, those trout, this is a 6-weight, the polyleaders 10-foot trout polyleaders will go over beautifully on this thing. So no trouble at all to cast that. If we're getting into the salmon and steelhead polyleaders, well, if we put them on the end of spay lines, we won't generally have much of a problem. I've used 10-foot salmon steelhead polyleaders on the end of spay lines for a long time. Delta lines, rage lines, shooting heads of various types. They all work beautifully. They all went. There's enough mass in those spay lines to turn over these polyleaders. And when we get into things like these 14-footers, any reasonably heavy spay line is going to turn that over. Especially a Skagit head, for example, or a Scout head. The Airflo Scout, they'll turn these things over, no trouble. There's enough mass in those heads to do the job. If we're getting into overhead lines, and I'm going to be turning over something like, where we go? Where's my 10-footer? There we go. This 10-foot super fast polyleader. I want something like this Sniper, 40 plus Sniper. Very, very heavy, short, heavy head in that line. Short front taper, thick tip. It'll blast that thing through the air, no trouble whatsoever. So if I was going after the really dense salmon steelhead leaders in an overhead rig, I want a matching line to do that. The Airflo Sniper 40 plus is a perfect taper to do the job because it's blunt. It'll turn over that heavy polyleader and your fly. So keep that in mind when you're going out to buy polyleaders, that the denser they are, the heavier they are, the more difficult they become to cast and turn over if your line is light. And if it has a long front taper with a skinny tip, it's meant for finesse presentation, those polyleaders are going to struggle on the end of a light trout line. I mean, those lines are just not designed to do the job. So you've got to look at, for the heavier ones, you've got to look at these blunt tapers, bass bug tapers, perfect example. Bass bug taper is going to work fine. That streamer line is going to work fine. The Sniper 40 plus is going to work fine. Something that has a short head, thick tip, short front taper, and then boom, over they go. Yeah, they cast beautifully. And there's an actual benefit to doing it. It's interesting. Sometimes when we're going for distance with one of these short, blunt heads, we get something called a head crash, where there's so much energy going through, and the tape is so short, it kicks over, and the whole thing ends up in a pile. You put a polyleader on these things, and all of a sudden they turn into wonderful distance lines. It's interesting how that works. The polyleader absorbs the energy, and the fly line and the polyleader and the leader and the fly just roll out beautifully. So if you're having some issues with casting for distance with a blunt tapered short head line, PolyLeader solves the problem quite nicely. So let's look at the uses. There's one. Smoothing out the cast for distance casting with these blunt taper lines. Getting a fly down when all you've got is a floater. Extending the leader if you really want to go further. They can be very useful if you want to turn, let's say, a bass bug line into something that you can spay cast. Adding a 10-foot polyleader floater, floating polyleader to the end of it, enables you to turn that thing into like a mini spay line. There's all sorts of different creative uses we can use for polyleaders beyond just simply getting a fly down, which is what everybody thinks of them, as a means of getting a fly down off of a floater. And that is a good use for them, obviously. But there's plenty of other uses as well, and you can get quite creative with them. So let's just recap. Remember that you've got a lot of choice going from light trout all the way up to heavy salt water. You need to have the breaking strain appropriate to your fishing. Make sure your tippet is always less than your breaking strain. Remember that the denser they are, the heavier they are, and when you get into the heavy ones, you've got to have the line that's capable of casting them and turning them over. But if you put those things together, they're lovely to use, and you'll catch a lot of fish on them. I'll tell you, that fast sinker 10-foot steelhead leader, I have caught a ton of steelhead on those over the years. So, yeah, they work fine. They catch fish. So, yeah, give them a try. Cheers.